Welcome to Blue Collar ICs, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on the interventional cardiology. Hosted by Jordy Collada, Bill Dixon, Brian Brown, and Todd Floor, this is where real doctors talk real work. From the cath lab to complex cases, new devices, and hard-earned lessons, these are the conversations that don't happen in textbooks. No hype, no fluff. Just experience, expertise, and straight talk. Welcome to the conversation. This is Blue Collar ICs.
Welcome into another edition of Blue Collar ICs. As always, joined by special guests this week. We got Dr. Bill Dixon, our host, another co-host, Dr. Brian Brown, who is sitting with a couple of special guests. We got a rep, Jim Schubert, and we got Dr. Amir Kaki here to talk about the Impella device here this evening. That is very interesting. We've got some current data. We're going to talk about the future of it. What is the future of it? So really looking forward to our conversation tonight. Doc, tell us about who you have joining us.
Thank you, Jordy. So, man, super excited. Really happy you guys are here. So I met Jim Schubert when I came to town here. I've been in practice almost 9 years, and I think I met you back then.
Yep.
Dr. Kaki is up in Detroit, as evidenced by his shirt, and he has been a big proponent of Impella a lot longer than I have. And I'm just so excited to talk about a product that I've been passionate about forever, despite adversity. So it's almost like these new trials, the adversity's already been there. So that's nothing new to me. But anyways, we're not going to start off with that. But why don't you both introduce yourselves and we'll go from there.
All right. Dr. Kaki, would you like to go or me?
Go ahead.
All right. As Dr. Brown mentioned, my name is Jim Schubert. I've been a industry representative for 37 years. That's why I have a lot of white hair. And I have spent a little time in general surgery way back with U.S. Surgical, but then I got into cardiology some 32 years ago, and it kind of meshed with my background. I was an exercise physiologist by education at grad school, and then did some cardiac rehab, cardiac physiology stuff. And so to me, cardiac is great. And so I joined Cordis Cardiology back when drug-eluting stents were starting. And then I joined the Impella team with Abiomed and 16 years ago, 2010. And since that time, I've seen a lot. And I've got to meet some great doctors across the U.S. And I currently am the senior director for regional development for the company across the U.S. And Amir Kaki is one of my good friends, too, and a guy that I always love talking to. So, Dr. Kaki?
Thank you. My name's Amir. I'm an interventional cardiologist in Detroit. Take care of a lot of patients and been using Impella for probably almost going on maybe 18, 20 years. I think the first one I put in was in 2009, maybe. But I'm really happy to be on the podcast. I pride myself as being what I like to say, a blue collar interventional cardiologist, and now I think I've made it to the mountaintop because I'm on.
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about.
I just have one request. Can we do the whole podcast in Jim Schubert's accent, or is that?
I'm gonna speed up the talk so you can understand it, man. Hey, don't act like you ain't got an accent.
All right.
Well,
all right.
great.
So one of the the impetus for this episode is the ACC meeting, and there were a couple of trials presented. One was the DTU trial, and one was the CHIP. How do you say it, Jim? The BSIS. I was going to say BSIS-3. So why don't we start with DTU? We were actually participants in the DTU trial. We were, you got to brag, we were the 6th highest enroller globally. We enrolled 28 patients.
So you're where all the bleeds came from? Oh, wait,
all the bleeds were outside the U.S. They were OUS bleeds. But kudos to my partners, Pablo Rengifo and John Catapodis, who pushed this. It was not an easy state to do. Basically, patients were randomized or common anterior stent, and in the throes of a heart attack, we have to talk to them and randomize them and say, we're going to take you to the cath lab, we're going to open the artery right away, or there's this pump that we think may help things, may take the work off of your heart, and we're going to let that run for 30 minutes, then we're going to open the arteries. So that's a little bit of a challenge to do any kind of STEMI trial when somebody's not doing their best. But we were in that trial. And,
Bill, can you tell us the basic science behind it as to why they thought this was a good
I
idea?
did some animal studies, and the science was actually very sound. It was very sound. They did animal studies that showed that if you unloaded the ventricle, even with an occluded artery, that you could decrease infarct size. And so that's kind of where it came from. I don't remember if they did any human studies with that before the trial, but there was definitely good data behind it. So I thought it was a great question. It was potentially game changing because my entire career, it's door to balloon and get it open as fast as possible. And it was incredibly difficult to sit there for 30 minutes. You couldn't even take an angiogram. But these patients had to have an anterior wall motion abnormality on LB gram before they were randomized. So it had to be abnormal. But it was very hard to sit there for 30 minutes. And so the trial showed that there wasn't any difference in infarct size, whether you put the pump in and waited 30 minutes or you did immediate PCI. Now, that's what the trial showed. Now, I could tell you it's very interesting because I had patients. Amir, were you in the trial also?
Yeah, we were in the early feasibility trial, and then we were also in the pivotal.
Yeah. What was amazing is I distinctly remember a patient. I told him we're going to put the pump in. He randomized to Impella. And after about 10 minutes, his ST elevation resolved, his chest pain resolved. And he looked over at me while we're just sitting there and he says, I like the pump. So there's no question that there was, and when we did the angiogram, the artery was still closed. The LAD was still occluded. So he had not reperfused. Anyway, that was our experience. That was the kind of a brief overview of the results. Hey, buddy. So Amir, what's your take?
So, I was very optimistic about DTU. Like you, we saw some. Sorry, hey, get out of here.
It's real life.
We saw good results when we were using it, and in the foundational work was actually done by Naveen Kapoor. It was his idea. He and his lab, he studied it, and he demonstrated in the animal model that with this concept, he could reduce infarct size, and that would ideally reduce heart failure and the longevity for these patients. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out in the RCT. We could get into some of the details, but the bleeding rates that we saw mitigated any potential benefit. That being said, what was interesting, though, despite the fact if you look at the patients who had delayed revascularization, their infarct size was no bigger than patients who got early revascularization or the standard of care, which begs the question, was the Impella protective in those patients? Which is interesting. So why did they not have bigger infarcts if the strategy didn't work? So that was something, one of the first things I observed. The bleeding complications, I think we saw that it was prohibitively high, which in my opinion is unacceptable. And I think that allows, for a lot of improvement, both as operators and miniaturizing the device. These are high bleeding risk patients who are coming in the setting, like you said, in the throes of an AMI, they're anticoagulated, antiplatelets, etc. But I do want to commend not only Naveen, who really came up with this concept, but really guys like you, Bill, people out in the field, our colleagues in Europe who participated. This is a remarkable trial to complete, and I think that in of itself should be celebrated.
Yeah, I think it was great science behind the question. And, our hypotheses don't always work out, but gosh, kudos for doing the trial. I thought it was, and people were asking, well, why would we even consider this trial? Because there was good science behind it.
Yeah.
And you don't know until you test the hypothesis. So
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think this idea of DTU is necessarily dead. I think in the form that it was studied, I think it answered the question. But I still, it's yet to be determined. What if we had miniature pumps like ECP, and we did it with ECP? If we had a bigger trial, more patients, it's yet to be determined. I don't think the science is dead yet, but we know right now that at least with the current device that's commercially available, that PCI via the radial approach in the setting of an anterior wall STEMI non-shock is still the standard of care.
So Brian and Jim, what are your thoughts?
Well, since it's off label, there's nothing really I can comment. I'm gonna have to listen to Dr. Kaki and Dr. Brown talk.
Don't tell anybody.
So, Bill, Amir, as fellow Blue Collar ICs, the way that this trial, when I heard about it, changed my practice a little bit was just a tad. So what I did was, if I saw a big anterior wall MI and someone was in shock on arrival, I would put the Impella in first and open up the artery moments later. But not because the data was informing me of anything. It was just, I didn't know that was possible. I always thought, well, I'll take the pictures first and put the Impella in later. But what I found anecdotally is that it made a lot of sense. I started seeing personally that we're avoiding intubation. You're putting that Impella pump in earlier. You're watching that person go from guppy breathing and looking like they're about to come off the table to going to sleep. And then you open up their LAD. So I didn't actually wait to open up anybody's LAD. I would just go ahead and do it. Again, I wasn't in the trial, but that's what I found in the community, and it's worked very, very well. And if you use more Impella, you understand how to avoid the bleeding complications, and you know how to mitigate the bleeding complications. So to say a therapy because it's large bore access shouldn't be used, but because it causes bleeding, I think the real answer is everybody should learn large bore access, how to do it well, how to do it right, and how to not lose a leg or have someone bleed to death while getting large bore access. That's what I would say is my answer.
So fine. How long would you typically leave that Impella and use the CPO? And is it overnight, 24 hours? What do you typically see? I know it varies.
So anecdotally, right, I'm trying to avoid any sort of vasopressor use, and it typically does that. So if it comes out the next morning, I see that as a win, not a loss.
Yeah. I think LVEDP is critical. So there was a cutoff in the trial. If the remind me, Amir, if the LVEDP was too high, I think they couldn't be randomized. But yeah. I've used Impella for STEMI when the EF is normal. Right. But you have an EDP of 40 and that patient is going to go into pulmonary edema unless you do something. So not the patient in the trial, but that's what we see in real life.
Yeah. So in the trial, Bill, you're right. If the patient's presented in cardiogenic shock, they were excluded. So you had to have non-cardiogenic shock AMI, so anterior wall MIs. The other thing that we do, at least in our practice, is we do right heart caths on all Impella patients, be it high-risk PCI or cardiogenic shock. And to your question, Bill, as to when do you take it out, we have a weaning protocol, and it's very simple, and it's very predictable of who's going to successfully wean. And our weaning protocol that Dr. Schreiber, I give credit to for really coming up with it, is when we have the right heart cath in and they're in the unit, there's a couple things that we look at. Number one is the left ventricular and diastolic pressure below 20. And so we use the PA diastolic pressure, obviously, because there's no direct measurement. And we also don't trust the current pump because it's an indirect measurement based on an algorithm. So in the absence of mitral stenosis, you could safely rely on the PA diastolic pressure. The second thing that we do is we look for a mixed venous O2 above 55 on low levels of support. And when we consider low levels of support, it's P3 or below. So if you're rounding in the morning, put them on P3, check the mixed venous O2. If it's above 55 and your EDP or your wedge is below 20, you could, with tremendous confidence, know that you could take that Impella out. The key also, once you make that determination, is something that Brian alluded to, is vascular access management. We're committed to taking those patients back to the cath lab for removal. So we don't just say, okay, this patient is weanable, have the fellow or or the staff pull the sheath. It doesn't work that way. We bring them back to the cath lab. We do endovascular tamponade.
You do a dry closure.
Correct. And we have a completion angiogram at the end of the procedure demonstrating flow down the leg, no thrombus, no extravasation of contrast, no flow limiting dissection is what we dictate. In every
Pre-close?
Yeah, we pre-close. And if you say you're a crash and burn case and you can't pre-close, we can post-close with a per-close and an angioseal, kind of a hybrid thing. But either way, and say you're not good at per-close. There's some people who don't know how to do per-close. That's okay. You could do prolonged inflation with endovascular tamponade.
I'm not great at per-close, I'll say it.
All right. Well, if you're not good at per-close, it's not a big deal. Just go up and over, do balloon tamponade. It will take you a little bit longer time, probably 30 to 45 minutes, but you're going to guarantee that patient has good hemostasis. And so to Brian's point earlier in the podcast, he's absolutely right. We as a community of interventionalists have to do better at vascular access management, mitigating the risk that we see. And everybody could do better. And I think the way to do better is protocolizing the care at your institution. Like for where I'm at, we all do it the same way. We've established a standard. Everybody comes back to the cath lab. We get access in the same standard way. And we have 20 different operators putting Impella in. And the expectation based on our vascular access and bleeding committee is, if you did everything this way and you still had to bleed, then, we forgive you and that's going to happen. But shortcuts don't work when we're taking care of these sick patients.
That's outstanding. People say, oh, it's a pain to take the patient back to the lab. I will tell you, an extra 30 or 45 minutes of successful hemostasis is far worth, 4 or 5 hours of misery.
Correct.
With hematomas. That's a phenomenal point. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get to something that Jim can actually talk about. So what can you talk about, Jim?
Talk about anything that you can ask me, consider on label and FDA indication.
High-risk PCI, that's on label, right?
Here's the fun part of this conversation. I think Amir Kaki's done a high-risk PCI or two, probably in his day. And so I love what we've done over 16 years. I mean, you did make mention, and I'll say this here regardless, I love the fact that we try to do different trials, to be honest. The field of mechanical support is here because of the foresight of doctors like yourselves that are willing to go out there and try things. And, just because a trial doesn't end up the way you think, it doesn't mean it's dead. And I always look at it this way. Let's look at these trials this way. Whether you have a win or a loss, generally there's film review after because you want to see what you did well, how you set the trial up, what was actually accomplished as a result of the trial. If you have a loss in the trial, then you look at that and say, did we make a mistake? Did we learn from it? And so a lot of the high-risk PCI trials, data sets, analyses, there's just a lot of stuff on high-risk PCI.
I think trial is going to be impossible to have this beautiful, amazing result because everybody has a different definition of what high risk is. I mean, Bill's always railing against these chip cases that are posted that are like standard PCI that we do day in and day out. So how do you design a high risk PCI trial and it actually be that sick person that, what did you say, Bill? Some of it can't take a joke?
They can't take a joke. That's my criteria. The patient can't take a joke. So, Jordy, are you familiar with Impella at all?
Yeah. No, a little bit. I was actually reading about it as you guys were talking about it and seeing,
So it's a phenomenal device. So it's a pigtail device. It's an impeller system that you put in the ventricle, and the blood goes into the catheter in the ventricle and comes out in the aorta, and it can deliver 3.5 to 4 liters a minute of blood flow. So it's phenomenal. So it's used in different settings. We use it cardiogenic shock, STEMI, and we're going to talk about this trial, but that's kind of the simple explanation of the device.
Explain how I want Jim and Amir to know who Jordy is. So Jordy, he ran the largest LSU podcast for years and years and years. He's the man.
And a lot of ears.
Our good buddies Todd Floor at Sala Scientific. They're coming out with their Aero Shield soon, the radiation reduction product, and they have the G-Lift lab. But anyways, what were we going to say, Jordy?
Really cool to be here tonight, fellas, in the presence of all of you guys and learning. Really, I take a great opportunity to sit and just listen each week to this podcast and really just take a lot away from it. I've been in the industry for about 1.5 years now in sales and device sales, and really centered around radiation protection with a great company at Salus Scientific and a fantastic mentor and Todd Floor. And I just love coming here and just kind of shutting up and listening. So it's cool to be here. Thank y'all for allowing me to be here, and it's cool to just learn.
All right, so Brian, you asked what constitutes high-risk PCI. Did you ask that question?
I did have a question. I did have a question where about the Impella, where it said that it was controlled by automation, an automated controller. Am I reading?
Well, Jim, you can talk about this, but there's a console, right?
Yeah,
You
automatically
plug it in.
console.
You plug this pigtail into the console, and it does stuff. It runs this motor. It's got a motor. But one of the things, it's large. It's 14 French to put it in the artery, and then you peel that away, and there's a 12 French. What's it called? A positioning sheath.
Reposition.
So it's not a small device. So not every patient that you want to use it can get it, because they may have severe PAD. They may be a tiny little lady. There are limitations, but probably a majority of patients can use it, Jim. Probably 80% of people that we want to put it in probably have decent anatomy for it. Would you agree?
You asking me or Jim?
Jim.
So I had the privilege of supporting as the Impella rep, probably, 1,200 cases.
1,000 were Brian's, right?
Yeah, Brian. So Brian's one. I think, I had,
What?
and working with Brian's been a treat. So he's not here. So, it's sincere when I say that. But my experience has been physicians are able to access with Impella when needed. I mean, we see very few cases aborted because of, peripheral vascular disease and or vessel size. You see some, but again, where there's a will, there's a way. And so many good doctors.
Yeah, maybe it's more like 90%. I don't know.
I'd probably say probably 90% of the time,
Yeah.
I've watched doctors able to access.
And IVL has probably expanded that a little bit.
Yeah.
Give us some option. So Amir, were you in the CHIP trial?
No, BSIS-3 was actually a
Oh, it was all Europe, right? All UK.
It was a European trial, and I think those guys should definitely be congratulated. It was a very, very difficult trial to do. They succeeded. They actually did a great job. If you look at their vascular access complications with a large bore device, they did great. So I think that they deserve a shout out. I think we learned a lot from them. If you look at the trial, the average BNP was 3,500. So 70% of the patients had ACS. So it wasn't like kind of the elective high-risk PCI population that we talk about in the States, where they're more stable outpatient, et cetera. This was a definitely higher acuity cohort of patients. They were able to do the trial. Some of the, constructive criticisms are things that they do differently than us. There wasn't a lot of right heart cath guidance. But despite the fact that the BNP was 3,500, they weren't tuned up before the procedure. There wasn't weaning protocols implemented in the trial. There was a lot of heart failure patients in the trial. So there's a lot of things that they did that we necessarily don't do the same here. Not to say that that discounts their work or the critical information that we learned from them. I think really the key, at least in the U.S. and in Europe, to drive the answer to a lot of the questions that we all want, it's going to be from Protect 4. If you look at Protect 4, which hopefully we'll see soon, there's about 4 times the size,
1,200 patients.
Yeah, BCC was about 350 patients, so much bigger. You have a mixture of U.S. and European operators. The patients were, much more homogeneous when we talk about, patient characteristics and so forth. There's going to be a lot of sub-studies that come out. looking at the utilization of right heart cath and different analyses. So I think P4 we anxiously await that. But again, I'm very thankful to the BSIS operators. I think they should be applauded too. Very, very impressive trial.
Yeah, so the BSIS trial was patients with complex anatomy and EF less than 35, and that was really it. So Brian, you asked what constitutes a high risk PCI. So you have to have complex anatomy, and then you have to have patient factors. So a low EF, a low blood pressure to start with, the high LVEDP, syntax score. So the results of the trial showed that there wasn't a benefit for Impella, and there was more bleeding and vascular complications. What is your take on that, Brian?
So I would never have I guess I do have a standard approach. It's my approach. But my point is, I'm not just going to carte blanche say, okay, this person, they need an Impella, right? I'm basing it on those factors that you're talking about. And sometimes I'm thinking in my head, of course, what does their vascular access look like? I know we can do alternative access, but we can also do PCI without the Impella. Obviously, we've been doing it for a long time. And so I got to think, what are the tools I'm going to use? Am I going to have to go on really long runs of rotoblator or orbital atherectomy? Am I going to have to put a shockwave in someone's left main and include flow to both their LAD and their circumflex while their LVDP is 35? So I'm thinking about what's going to happen during this procedure. I don't want to put an Impella that I don't believe is necessary, ever, because it's a lot of additional work and time. But I can tell you clearly, over and over again, there are patients that while you are performing this high-risk surgical turn-down multi-vessel PCI, that patient would crash. In fact, there are people that crash with the Impella in, and then you're thanking yourself that you already had the Impella in place and that it's sitting there during their PEA arrest during your multi-vessel PCI. Those are the high-risk individuals. So I would say that this doesn't inform my personal practice at all. I have formed my personal practice, and I will adapt to data as I see fit. But frankly, I've seen enough. The device literally works in the patients that I choose for it to work in.
Well, and this is the number one thing. When it first came out, I think a lot of us looked at it it's kind of like TikTok medicine versus long-form discussion on podcasts, right? The headlines look bad. But then, to Amir's point, there are a lot of differences. And if you read the supplement, the differences become pretty glaring in terms of how the patients were treated, the strategies treated, number of vessels treated, ACS, how many were ACS patients, GMP 3,500. I had one physician call me, and being able to talk to doctors across the U.S., I always ask this question. If you had a patient show up with a BMP of 3,500, an EF of 26, 27%, a fairly elevated LVEDP, would you put an Impella in, do a multi-vessel revasc, and then take the device out before you send them to ICU? And almost to a doctor, I haven't had one yet, they've all said no. That I wouldn't treat that patient that way because guidelines in the U.S. are different. We know that on an acute on chronic type heart failure patient. And so when I asked, they start telling me what they would do. I'll put that to y'all. Is that somebody you do a complete revasc in and then take the pump out and see what happens?
So Amir, do you know in the BSIS trial, was the Impella removed in the cath lab? Do you know?
Yeah, it was not kept in the patients. And so that is a potential concern, a little bit different than how we do things in the States. There wasn't a formalized protocol on weaning the patient. The patients were sick. There's no question that the patients were definitely high acuity, very complex. The operators often did a lot of revascularization, which is something that I admit that when the Impella's in there, we tend to be very ambitious to take advantage of the device, given not only the the economic expense, but the expense and the risk to the patient that's being subjected to it, where you want to take advantage of that. Now, given the BSIS data, is that the right strategy? Are we doing too much when the Impella's in? That's something that we need to ask ourselves. And I think that we still have a lot to learn. To Brian's point, after a while, you start to kind of figure out which patients you think would benefit. I think these studies is really hard for us to come up with. We see so many patients and they're all different, and some of them have different comorbid conditions and so on and so forth. But when you use the device enough, you start to realize, especially after a case, you say, hey, you know what? I would have probably been in trouble had I not used it. And by the same token, there are some patients where you put the device in, and at the end of the case, it went so smooth, and you say, hey, you know what? I probably could have got away without using it. So I don't think that we're really, as good as we think we are at choosing which patients. I think given this data, me, who has been a big advocate for MCS and Impella in particular, I'll go back now to my patients. And if I have a patient who has bifurcation left main disease and a normal EF and a big patent right coronary artery, I used to put Impella in those patients without hesitation. Now I would probably think twice given some of the data that we're seeing. So I think that, every patient we have to approach differently and use the best information that we have, take into consideration the risk we're subjecting the patient to, take into consideration our own limitations with operators. And another big part about it is our limitations as a team, your cath lab staff, who's going to help you take care of these patients when they get out of the cath lab if the device has to stay in. Those are things that aren't studied, but are very, very real and practical when you're taking care of patients, So if you're at a weak hospital and you have terrible ICU staff, and your threshold for keeping the Impella in may change, and it may be at the detriment of the patient because you don't have the confidence that the patient could be cared for safely. So those are things that are very hard to account for in a clinical study, but are real world things that challenge us every day.
Amir, kind of one of the things I've heard from several doctors has been, first and foremost, should this trial have been done? I mean, all the doctors that I talk to say, yeah, great, let's do randomized trials. We love them. It was an economic study first and foremost, right? They're trying to see if there's going to be an economic advantage to doing this, but there wasn't necessarily, strict treatment regimens in each arm. And so a lot of doctors have said, can we draw from issues that it was an Impella's fault, or was it the strategy or what was done from a patient perspective? And so that's why a lot of people are now starting to say, is more always better in this phenotype of patient? Because an acute on, what they're telling me is, and when I pass my boards, I'll tell you what I think, but what they tell me is an acute on chronic patient, that ACS presentation is a lot different than a STEMI patient, and their progression and care looks a lot different. And so you can't necessarily treat that phenotype the same. And I think that was a learning right there. I mean, would you agree or disagree?
No, I agree. And, we have, very talented, experienced operators, Bill and Brian, on the call. But I think, at least I'll speak to my practice. If someone is in decompensated heart failure and they have multivessel disease and assume they've been turned down by surgery, we really optimize these patients before we instrument them. And there's a lot of ways that we could optimize them. We could put a swan in, we give them afterload reducers, we give them diuretics. We do a lot of things, oftentimes tuning them up and optimizing them to give them the best chance during the index procedure. I don't rush into high-risk PCIs, obviously, unless it's a life-threatening situation. And the things where I would rush in irrespective of being optimized are things that are intractable arrhythmias, retractable, angina, cardiogenic shock, hemodynamic instability, so on and so forth. But if you have a patient who presents with ACS and profound heart failure, clinically and as evidenced by biomarkers, at least in my practice, those patients would be optimized before being instrumented and revascularized. I'd be interested to see what Bill and Brian, how you guys take care of these patients.
Yeah, I think hemodynamics are critical. Because like I said, if the patient can't take a joke, if you start with a blood pressure in the 90s and their EDP is 30, they have nowhere to go. like anything. I mean, you look at them wrong, something bad's going to happen. So in the BSIS trial, they only used EF, as far as I know. They used EF and complexity of coronary disease. So they didn't really look at hemodynamics.
Right.
I use Impella for hemodynamics. So I do a lot of complex coronary work without Impella because high-risk PCI isn't strictly coronary anatomy. It's coronary anatomy plus patient factors. What's their EDP? That's huge. Well, EF is important, but to me, EDP is more important. What's their renal function? What's their respiratory status? I think a lot of operators conflate complex coronary anatomy with high-risk PCI. The anatomy doesn't make the patient high risk. That's part of it. And so I don't know if BSIS-3 captured the true high-risk patients. They just looked at low EF. And we have plenty of patients with EF less than 35 who EDP is 15. And they have a mid-left main lesion. That's a 5-minute case. You're in and out. I think with BSIS-3, you might be right that so the Impella arm got more complete revascularization. But maybe you shouldn't be doing a 2 or 3 hour multi-vessel revascularization in a sick patient. Pick the biggest bang for the buck and stage some of this stuff.
And that's what the guidelines say, right, Dr. Dixon? I mean, on this particular patient.
When I'm doing, quote, high-risk PCI, have a plan. These are almost always elective to some degree. Have a plan. Get in, get out, and don't spend forever screwing around, rotablating 3 vessels. I mean, only bad things can happen. So I think patient selection is absolutely critical. It's an impressive device. But before Impella, I wasn't putting balloon pumps in for every complex coronary case. We might stick a 4-foot sheet. We might have access just in case. But, in the semi-elective high-risk PCI, what are the chances something bad happens? Is that hemodynamic collapse? It's actually pretty low, but part of that, it also depends on what is your plan and what are you doing. Those are my thoughts. And that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah. And I thought an interesting comment. I did hear from one doctor. I'd like to get Brian's take on it. One doctor said, one of the authors made the comment that I think it was, don't quote me, but they were psychologically had a air of psychological superiority because the patient was so stable. To Amir's point, do you do all this work even though the patient's stable, or do you consider the phenotype of the patient, the presentation of the patient as it goes along? So, I mean, how do you speak to that with the investigators actually admitting that?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a second, but before I forget, I've been thinking about something Amir said. He talked about the aftercare, and I wanted to give kudos to Abumed for leading the way and showing how to train cath lab staff, train CCU staff, train CBRU staff to be there in the ICUs and to train people. So when I talk to other companies like Inari or whoever else, it's the model of a rep Abumed showed. So I want to throw that out there.
That's one of the hardest jobs.
Back to your question, it's really about something else Amir said and Bill was just talking about. And I'm at a point in my career where I think, I'm younger than both of you, but I've definitely arrived at this level. I will think back to how I was trained, and I will think about some of my partners when they're asking me, looking at a high-risk PCI before they do it, what about this? What about that? What about this? I say, remember, this person was turned down for surgery. You just need to make it better. You don't need to make it perfect. Do it safely and make it better. And that doesn't mean they needed Impella. That may mean that you go in there, like Bill said, and you fix something and you get out and that person's safe and you've made it better, not perfect.
No. And to what Amir does so well in the high-risk PCI area, a lot of people think there's overuse of the device, but the numbers don't bear that out because high-risk PCI, as Dr. Dixon says, it's multifactorial, There's patient characteristics, there's lesion characteristics, there's hemodynamic characteristics, there's all these things going on. And so it's only a couple of percentage points of the time that Impella is actually needed. And it's generally specifically needed for amalgamation of all those factors coming together.
Do you know how many Impellas our institution put in last year?
Gosh, no.
Like 100,
I would probably say
60? I don't know.
80 to 100. Yeah.
80 to 100, and we did 1,600 PCIs. So it's not like we're using this, nonstop, but there's appropriate cases it's needed. I don't know what your guys' percentages are like.
Yeah, I think you guys probably do more than us now. We maybe did. I think we looked at our numbers. We did about 80 as an institution, including high-risk PCI and cardiogenic shock. Yeah, but your point is well taken. It's a small fraction of all the cases that come through the lab. We're pretty selective on the patients that we use it on. Very judicious based on, Jim said it, I thought he said it very eloquently. When you talk about high-risk PCI, it's not just the anatomy, it's the anatomy, the comorbid conditions, the complexity of the anatomy. You take all of that into consideration. And so I think that's the challenge. High-risk PCI is ill-defined right now. What I may think is high risk, Brian may think is relatively low risk. And I think that's why we've had a hard time historically before these trials comparing apples with apples. And I think despite the fact that these trials are, we'll say neutral or negative, I still think that we're learning a lot, about these subgroups of patients. And the reality is, guys, patients are getting older. The disease is getting worse, at least when they're presenting, and it's getting tougher. But we really need our industry partners to keep up with us to make it so that we can continue to take care of these patients. And so I applaud Abumed's commitment to research. I applaud their commitment to education, not only for the physicians, but as mentioned, for our cath lab staff and beyond in the ICU and so forth. I do think that I say this all the time, and I say this respectfully to our colleagues in interventional cardiology. The devices are going to have their limitations, but I think we also have a responsibility as operators to be able to have a skill set to take care of these patients. And we can't always implicate technology when we have our own deficiencies. But I think everybody sees that own institution. Not every operator is the same, and some people are willing to learn. Some people are unwilling to learn. Some people shouldn't be doing these cases, and some people should be doing them. And so I think that's always an uncomfortable conversation to have, but I think it's something we have to start doing some reflection upon ourselves. Abumed has to evolve. They have to make the device smaller. I think they're doing that. They have to continue to do the research and help us, define who's going to benefit, because us as operators have to continue to learn and evolve and develop the skill sets to best use these devices on our patients. I really believe that.
Well said.
How would you change the BSIS trial if you had to do it over again? What things do you think? I mean, let's do some film studies, right? Let's be a Detroit Lion and long suffering, even though he's a Chicago Bear. But doing the film study, man, what would you change? What would you do? Because the supplement does show some glaring differences in treatment strategies. And
yeah, I think I alluded to it earlier. I think that what I would do different, I would make sure that these patients were optimized. So using the right heart cath to optimize patients, and then after they're optimized at whatever optimization standard was agreed upon, then proceeding with the PCI. Would that change the outcome? I'm not sure. I'd be curious to know if that was one of the reasons that we didn't see the results that we expected. I also think, Bill said that, also like just because you have an Impella in doesn't mean you should be, doing atherectomy on multiple vessels. There was a point when even Abumed, Schubert, we got to hold you accountable when you guys were advocating for multi-vessel revascularization and do as much as possible because you have the Impella in. That was something that you guys advocated for. So I think we have to be cautious now, saying, maybe we shouldn't do more. I think the real answer is I don't think we know, and I think the better is the cautionary approach, which is I think less is more in some of these cases, particularly when you're dealing with patients who are very sick, who have bad LVs, have a lot of comorbid conditions. I agree with Brian's strategy about, fixing the low-hanging fruit, trying to get the most you can, and then living to fight another day. So I think we have to be careful in criticizing not only the study, but the operator's approach, given what we all advocated, those of us who supported and believed in Impella before, with the utilization of more revascularization when you have the device in. So I think we don't know, but I think now we have to be even more cautious than we have been in the past.
Yeah, Dr. Kaki, and I would say, yeah, look, there were certainly some signals there that potentially complete revasc, might be beneficial, right?
Yeah.
The phenotype of the patient that was being treated in BSIS is different from the phenotype of the patient that got approval by the FDA, as well. And then I still say, man, I still go back to PROTECT 2 and go, everybody said, it was stopped in futility and it was a failed trial. But once we figured out that we did a poor job of defining periprocedural MIs and we adjusted for that, and George Dangus did some great work. We did see that clinically relevant periprocedural MIs, kind of changed a little bit of the viewpoint of the outcome of the trial. So,
Yeah, but
I love seeing some of that stuff actually get done. You know what I mean?
No, but I'll push back on you now as an Abiomed guy and me as an old country doc. We have to be very honest with ourselves. Look, the trial, PROTECT 2 was a neutral or negative trial. Okay. BSIS-3 was negative. PROTECT 4 is yet to be determined. We can't take these trials and analyze them retrospectively in the way that we like. We have to take the data as is and do the best we can with that information moving forward with our patient. By the same token, you guys had a wonderfully done trial that was executed in danger and cardiogenic shock, and it changed the standard of care. Right. And no one is ever going to challenge us about the utility of using Impella in a patient who's danger eligible. So, I think as an operator and as a physician, these trials are very meaningful. I think they're very important, and we have to be intellectually honest when we're approaching these trials. And I think that's the only way to move the field forward. If we can't produce a positive trial, then I think we have to keep going back to the drawing board and see, what are we doing wrong, what we could do better. But I don't think it's fair to the science, to the patients, to the investigators who do these trials, to retrospectively analyze them and be critical. I think we have to take the data as it is and do the best we can moving forward. And when we have a positive trial, we're going to run with it. When we have a negative trial, we'll reevaluate it and see what we could do. That's what I think that we should do as physicians.
So can I ask you, because I love these kind of conversations. Yeah, you and I have had them forever, right?
Yeah.
I still think it's reasonable to, whether positive or negative, to see what drove that, correct?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I'm saying with respect to, 2 rounds normal versus 7 to 8 times. Better insight.
But we have to be careful not to be revisionist, and we have to be careful not so much, to try to change it, or, you have to think about these trials are not only rigorously done, but before these trials are done, there's committees of dedicated people who have pre-specified endpoints, and all of this is thoughtful. And I think that we shouldn't discount that. The trial was negative. We can definitely look at the data and say, hey, were there any signals where we could help certain subgroups of patients? I think that's very fair. Is there signals there we should study another group of patients in another trial? I think that's fair. But if there's a negative trial and we don't like it, I don't think it's fair for us to try to justify the utilization based on something that was not pre-specified or a subgroup or something we don't have statistical analysis to support. So I think that we as the interventional cardiology community going to continue in every specialty in medicine. I think we are the most prolific at demanding evidence. And I think that's been to the benefit of our patients. And especially in MCS, we got to continue to do that. And I tell my colleagues all the time, and I'm probably one of Abiomed and Impella's biggest fans, but I'm also a tough critic, because at the end of the day, it's not about me or Abiomed. It's about what's best for the patients. And we have to remain intellectually honest to get to that point where we know the impact.
And I don't mean to say there's any intellectual dishonesty. I'm more doing film review to say, okay, you do the next trial, what do you do different, right?
Yeah.
Or do you do the next trial? Which
I think that's totally fair. But the overarching fact is that in high risk PCI so far, we have not produced a positive trial. That doesn't mean there's no utility for the device. I just think that it's, the onus is upon us now to be more selective and more judicious in patient selection. And we have to be better at access, and bleeding. And we have to understand more what we're doing. I think that's what I get from these trials. Is BSIS-3 going to change my practice? Probably not very much, to be very frank with you. But I do think that it's going to put me on much higher alert now when I'm thinking about doing a patient who's on the lower risk of the high risk spectrum. I may or may not use an Impella when I used to use it probably more liberally. I'll be very frank with you.
So the data drive a little bit of your decision making based on looking at that whole data set, patient phenotype, presentation, progression of the patient, which is
The one thing I would have done differently, or I would do in the future, is stratify based on LVEDP. LVEDP at 15 is very different from 30 or 35. So I would do that. Like Amir, I don't think BSIS-3 changes my practice because I don't do a lot of protected PCI. I do patients who are hemodynamically unstable to begin with, who are marginal from a hemodynamic standpoint, but I don't use Impella just because they have complex anatomy. I have a good plan. Now, one thing I would absolutely take back to Abiomed. We all know how to put them in, but apparently we all don't know how to take them out. I would use Amir's experience, people that do it really well, and I would say this is the standard. Yeah. This is let me tell you, all right, I might scare you a little bit, Jim. You know how I remove Impellas? I make sure that I can draw off the sidearm and they have good pulses, and I pull it out and I use the fem stop.
Wow.
And I've done that.
I've probably seen a lot worse that I can't comment on.
So that's the way I do it, and I get away with it. But that doesn't mean I can't do it better. And I'm really interested in how Amir's group does it. I love things in a controlled fashion. Yeah. So I would focus on explant training, man. I would really do that for Impella. We all know how to put it in, but taking it out, it's very different.
I would still say we all don't know how to put it in. There's a lot of knowing the vessel and where you're getting access and all that. You look at it and say, maybe I don't put it there. Maybe that's not a good idea. But I don't think you learn how to use the device until you use it a lot. So I'm not realistically railing against anything. I'm confident and happy with what I do in the community here. What I will say, though, is that people that don't use it, saying it has no benefit, are doing a disservice to their patients.
Oh, 100%. And I think, and that the problem, Brian, is that this kind of stuff gives fuel to the naysayers. BSIS-3, Protect 2, the biggest critics I've had. And I was an early adopter of Impella when it wasn't cool. I was an early adopter when it wasn't mainstream. And all the critics, this is fuel for the critics. That's why I think the onus is on us as interventional cardiologists to do the best job possible with the information that we have. Abiomed, to their credit, has to continue to innovate. The device has to become smaller. It has to become smarter. They're doing that. But we can't rest on our laurels, and that trial just supports that idea. And the good news is that we're not, as the interventional community, gonna rest on our laurels. We're going to continue to innovate. We're going to continue to get better. Abiomed is committed, to the research. They're committed to education. And so I think the future is bright for MCS, despite what we saw with BCS, despite what we saw with DTU. I think Danger Shock was a game changer. It's changed the guidelines. It's going to save a lot more lives. And I don't think that we should be on our heels right now. We should just keep forging forward. And Brian, there's patients that you saved in high-risk settings that would have died without an Impella. Bill, you know that. And all of us that take care of sick patients know that. And so we're going to refine this and hopefully standardize it to the best patients that need it.
Yeah, really good stuff about danger from doctors across the U.S. I mean, just looking at the trial, but I still love having robust conversations about trials. I think it's I think it's
Danger is Brian's middle name. So
you said now.
Danger's Brian's middle name. So we're going to finish up. So the title of this episode is Impella dead? So yes or no, Brian, is Impella dead?
Not yet.
Amir,
Yes or no? No, I think Impella is strong and Impella is growing. ECP will be a game changer, and cardiogenic shock standard is Impella. It's going nowhere, so it's alive and strong.
Yep, I completely agree. Jordy, you want to take us out?
Excellent episode. Tons of information as always. Make sure and follow us on social media and hit us on all of the outlets here for Blue Collar ICs. For Dr. Bill Dixon and Dr. Brian Brown, our special guest, Jim Schubert and Dr. Kaki up in Detroit. Go Lions, as they got a chance here going into year 4 with the Bears fan.
You've been listening to Blue Collar ICs, real conversations from the front lines of interventional cardiology. Special thanks to hosts Jordy Collada, Bill Dixon, Brian Brown, and Todd Floor for sharing their insight, experience, and perspective. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and share the show. Join us next time for more real-world cardiology, only on Blue Collar ICs. Blue Collar ICs is a production of the RealWorks Media Network, Tallahassee, Florida,